When people find out I'm an air ambulance doctor, I often get asked, what's the worst thing you've ever seen? I dread that question. I've seen a lot of terrible things. But now, I'm going to ask you, what's the worst thing you've ever seen in your time working in healthcare? I could bet that everyone has at least one story, that one patient who will never leave them. I hope you will allow me to share a story or two of mine. One of my worst was also my first, and I remember every detail of it. I was a third-year medical student on my first clinical placement in A&E. A couple of weeks in, the red phone rang. It was HEMS, the air ambulance. They were bringing in a burn victim. In those days, the resus room was tiny, just 3 bays, all close together, and it was packed. When the patient was wheeled in, the first thing that hit me was the noise. The room was pin-drop silent, except for what remains one of the worst things I've ever heard, the groans of the black, charcoaled human being who had become my patient. She was elderly, trapped in a house fire, disabled, unable to escape. I remember everything about that day. The smell of burned flesh, the sight of one of her legs incinerated into a child's stump. Always the moaning. It would later turn out that the only person in the room who didn't know that 80% burns in an 80-year-old was unsurvivable was me. The HEMS doctor was the first to verbalize it, quietly, at the back of the resus room where I stood. Something in my face must have given me away, because in a moment that would go on to define my career, he told me this. If I felt everything you are feeling now, I wouldn't be able to get back out and get on with the job. I was hooked on emergency medicine, on critical care, on HEMS. But honestly, I didn't know if I was right for the job. And I wondered, are the people I so admire born like this? Or is everything they've seen made in this way? I had to know. I would spend the next few years researching empathy, trying to find out if it was possible to care too much, whether there was a switch in my brain that I could flick that would stop me feeling and allow me to get on with the job. My research took me over to the US, to Johns Hopkins, when I was fortunate to work under an incredible mentor, Professor Meg Chisholm. And what we found came as a shock to me as an idealistic medical student just wanting to help. Those who enter a healthcare profession have a higher baseline empathy than the general population. But at some point, that empathy declines. In fact, it falls off a cliff. And it's not just doctors. This pattern can be seen across healthcare, in nurses, in midwives, in radiographers, paramedics. In all of our cases, our empathy takes a nosedive, and it never fully recovers. So what's going on? Have clinicians found the elusive switch? Have they learned to stuff their empathy away, protecting themselves and their patients? It's not that actually really at all. Fast forward several years, and I found myself in the middle of the decline. Actually, in hindsight, I don't think I was in the middle. I was possibly at rock bottom. I could perform under pressure, but suddenly I'd become the kind of doctor I never wanted to be. Cynical, cold even, staggering from one shift to the next, another burnt out and broken statistic. I was a registrar in an outstanding emergency department that I had once loved. But the first NHS winter crisis had hit, and it was a war zone. There were trolleys of patients around every corridor. Resus was overflowing. The waiting room was standing room only. Ambulances stacked outside the doors. Patients were angry, rightfully so. And as the most senior doctor on overnights, their anger was directed at me. Every shift was just fighting fires we could never get on top of. I lived in constant fear, trying to pick out the needle in the haystack, the patient who just couldn't wait, knowing, as exhausted and run ragged as I was, that eventually I was going to miss something. I was also pregnant, in my second trimester. Nobody was being kind to me, and in truth, I was finding it really hard to be kind to others. Something had to give, and it did, just not in the way I ever expected. At just 24 weeks, I broke my waters and went into premature labour. A couple of weeks in University Hostel Southampton later, and Joshua made his dramatic entrance into the world. Over 3 months early, and weighing less than 2 pounds. It's hard to explain what that time was like. Mums had their precious bundles of joy in cots next to them. Proud dads and besotted relatives would coo over them. And I would look on, hollow, over 2 floors above where I knew my baby was, out of reach in the neonatal intensive care unit. The next morning, my husband wheeled me down to see our little boy. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. An alarm I quickly identified as the crash bell was going off. And as we walked onto the unit, there were a crowd of people at Joshua's end of the room. Selfishly, I thought, please don't let that be my baby. But it was. A nurse saw us enter the unit and hurriedly turned us around, and we were taken to the room. Everyone here will know a room like this. There's usually a couple of sofas, a watercolour on the wall, and a box of tissues. As an A&E and intensive care doctor, I spent a lot of times in rooms just like this, so I knew what it meant, and it meant really bad news about our son. Then, a consultant we'd never met came into the room and sat on the other sofa. "I'm sorry," he said. "I've not got good news." And with endless empathy and boundless compassion, he told us what had happened to our son. The words hit me thick and fast. Massive pulmonary hemorrhage, prolonged resuscitation, inotropes, nitric, 100% oxygen. Words I was all too familiar with. Words that meant overwhelmingly we were unlikely ever to be able to take our baby home. Joshua had had a massive bleed into his lungs, and the team had been resuscitating him for about 45 minutes. They'd done everything that they could, tried every trick up their sleeve, and Joshua was clinging to life. The consultant had to go back to his team then to look after Joshua. All I could think was so far he'd been so fragile that I hadn't even been able to hold him. The thought that he would die without him ever knowing his mummy. Then, a face around the door. The consultant was back. "I'm sorry, I need to be with your son, but I think we're winning." Another excruciating wait. We squeezed each other's hands until they were white. And then, he was back. "Do you want to come and see him? I think he needs his mummy and daddy." I'd been holding it together until this point. But then, I saw our son. He was smaller than the palm of my hand, in this huge perspex box, this massive incubator, surrounded by pumps, monitors, the ventilator. He looked so small. I couldn't even touch him. Even putting my pinky into his tiny little hand might be enough to destabilize him off the tightrope of life he was on. I wished desperately that he was still inside me, where I could keep him safe. But I was an outsider, his mother, thinking this was all my fault, that I had done this to our son, banished to hovering at the edges of his incubator, which had become his surrogate womb. An intensive care doctor, unable to do anything to save him. "You're all right," said the consultant. "If this was my child, I'd be crying too." And when I turned, his eyes were misty. He hugged us then, and if I hadn't already, I now had complete faith in what I now know to be one of the UK's highest performing neonatal teams. They all cared so deeply about what happened to my son, and they weren't about to let him die on their watch. And slowly, the nurses coaxed him back to life. It was touch and go. The chaplain performed an emergency baptism, and whilst hanging unit after unit of blood and tending to all the machines keeping Joshua alive, the nurses still somehow found times to stand in as his godparents. Desperate for something to do, I read Joshua the first chapter of Harry Potter that night. It's called The Boy Who Lived. I'd like to think that he could hear my voice through all those lines, tubes and wires, and he rallied. 3 months of intensive care later, and Joshua would become the boy who lived. The nurses in particular, but the whole team, were not only Joshua's guardians, but became my rock. Joshua put them through it. It was always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and just when we thought he would make it, he would fall in a heap again. On Facebook, I would see my friends' babies hitting their milestones, rolling over, crawling, that first smile, and it made my heart ache. But the nurses made sure that we celebrated every one of Joshua's milestones, doubling his birth weight from 2 to 4 pounds, the moment he finally came off the ventilator after weeks of being unable to breathe for himself. And finally, the first time I was able to hold my child in what seemed like an age after he was first born. I started this journey burnt out and broken and feeling as unresilient as it was possible to be. But the endless empathy shown to me by the neonatal team helped put me back together. Joshua survived his journey, no doubt due to their calm excellence, and 3 months later, we were able to take home the boy who lived. A year later, I knew I had to return to medicine. I recently read an article in the Washington Post. It posed the question, would you prefer a kind physician or a smart one? But I ask, why do they have to be mutually exclusive? Not being empathic goes against our nature as healthcare workers, and actually, we know it takes a lot of mental effort to remain detached under pressure. And the truth is, we just don't know what the long-term effects are of suppressing all of that. What we do know is that the real problem comes when that suppression becomes permanent, when you cannot flick that switch back, when you can no longer allow yourselves to feel at all. And why does it happen? Well, what we found was this. Take a bright-eyed healthcare student who wants to do their best for their patient and put them into a healthcare system. It will change them. Sleep deprivation, antisocial hours that take you away from your family and friends, complaints, the blame culture, bullying, the dark side of medicine, stuff we don't talk about but we really should. The list goes on, but all of these factors will speed up your descent into cynicism. Now think about what we do to those who come and work in the NHS. It's the best job in the world, right? But it comes at a price. The loss of empathy is one of the 3 pillars of burnout. And burnout really has become the buzzword of not just healthcare systems, but corporate organizations, hasn't it? Great, let's fix it. But the fix they came up with? Resilience. Resilience seems to have morphed into a way for employees to say, it's not me, it's you. To make this somehow a very personal failure, instead of resilience being a team sport. To deflect accountability for putting people into a broken system and then blaming them when they inevitably break. What's wrong with all of this is that it's wrong. In fact, it is exactly those highly competent, psychologically healthy, seemingly resilient people who are most at risk of burnout. I read this quote. It talks about doctors, but actually I think it applies to all of us in healthcare. And it says this: physicians are smart, tough, resourceful people. If there was a way to MacGyver themselves out of the situation by working smarter, harder, or differently, they would have done it already. So I want to reframe this debate and introduce you to the concept of moral injury. Moral injury came from the military and is often likened to death by 1,000 cuts, by seeing things that go against our moral code, or what we feel is right. 1 or 2 traumas, 1 or 2 times we weren't able to give the care that we desperately need to a patient because of wait times, because of targets, because of delivering medicine in a corridor, we might be able to get past that. But repeated traumas over time notch away at us and eventually lead to an often unrecognised deep sense of guilt and shame. The NHS, in my mind, is the most amazing healthcare system in the world, isn't it? It saved my son. But it has its flaws. And often I think we are also aware of how precious our system is and how lucky we are that we don't talk about the other stuff. Because the truth is, at the moment, the NHS is understaffed. The truth is, the NHS is under-resourced. And the truth is, the NHS fosters a culture of blame, which often sees individuals scapegoated when a patient falls through the cracks. So let's start talking about it. We will all have colleagues who are where I was, where turning up for work every day feels like walking through treacle. Maybe you're there yourself. It's a lonely place to be, and often it can feel like you're the only one struggling, and that you're somehow a failure for not being as resilient as your colleagues seem to be. But it's not you. You're not a failure for struggling in a struggling system. And if I surveyed your place of work, over half of doctors alone are suffering from burnout. So why aren't we talking about it? So let's start being compassionate in a place of work that often isn't. Don't underestimate the power of kindness. Showing kindness and empathy to your colleagues not only has a direct influence on their empathy, but also on their performance. And that colleague not showing empathy, they're likely in the decline and suffering from moral injury. They are most in need of your compassion. So to finish, here's a strategy I'd like you to take away with you. It's something I call the double tap. First tap, are you okay? Naturally, the answer to this question will always be, I'm fine, because we're British, and that's just what we do. But ask again, are you really okay? Or would you tell me if you weren't? Or my personal favourite, are you sure? Because you just don't seem yourself lately. And then a few days later, ask them again. So how does this story end? Joshua is 2 now. He is the boy who lived. Most people never get to meet their heroes, and I gave birth to mine. At just 1 day old and 900 grams, Joshua showed more resilience than I can ever hope to muster. The kindness and empathy shown by the neonatal team helped my family so much, but rebuilt me as a clinician. But Joshua is my real inspiration. I returned to medicine. I founded the Doctors Association UK, fighting every day for a more compassionate place for our staff in the NHS and our patients. And soon after, I got my dream job. I now work for the air ambulance, and my mental toughness comes from the resilience of the team around me, so that I too can be there for someone on the worst day of their lives and get someone's son home to their family. That's why we do the job that we do. Never forget it. In a world where you can choose to be anything, choose to be kind. Thank you.